that.
Excellent. I'm joined this morning by Adele Morris. Adele, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Shelley. Sorry, my picture's a bit fuzzy this morning. In fact, I've gone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, it's all right. For some reason, so I'm going to tell you, I'm going to switch off my camera. Get rid of that. Yeah, so I'm Adele Morris, and for 16 years I was a councillor in the London Borough of Southwark. And I got very involved in planning during that time because I represented a ward where planning was singularly the biggest issue in the ward that affected people, lots of very large developments. So I got really interested in it to the point where I did a master's degree in urban regeneration. But I also, when I was on one of the boards at the Local Government Association, I got involved with the Planning Advisory Service and have been working as a member peer for the 5 or 6 years. And that what that means is that I support the Planning Advisory Service officers with training, particularly training committee members. I also do some political mentoring of individual cabinet members and planning committee chairs, and have taken part in the full service planning reviews. So with the PAS team, I've done a whole range of being part of the support activities for local authorities. Thanks, Shelley.
That's great. It's lovely to have you with us this morning. So I'm going to cover a little bit about the sort of basics. So planning is a really exciting profession, but what's quite often not talked about is that it operates in a political environment. It's meant to be quite factual, based on policies, based on kind of does it comply, but it is very much a kind of politically influenced environment. So there are roughly 17,000 councillors working in local authorities up and down the country, and their key role is to represent either on ward level or borough or district level the people that live in it. And that demands them to be quite visible, almost sort of operate as the shop window to the council, and to be a kind of effective advocate to the officer side for those local people. Now, that can be where the tension arises, because councillors need to ensure that the views of local communities are kind of represented and fed into decisions. And sometimes those views are at odds with what an established policy might be, or what the national planning policy framework might be. So there's sometimes that tension between our work and the views of local communities. So councillors can have multiple roles or wear many hats. So you can have councillors that are sitting on a parish or town council, so dealing with really kind of grassroots local issues. They might also sit on a neighbourhood plan group. They might also be a ward councillor, which is a kind of specific geographical area within a borough or district. They might be a local councillor, so sitting on the council. Some of that might mean that they have a board role, so within planning committee, or sitting on a cabinet, or even a kind of portfolio holder looking after a particular area of council function. And again, they might also be a county councillor where a two-tier system exists, or sitting on a kind of mayoral board as well. And councillors become councillors for lots of different reasons, and we'll share the slides after this, but there's a link to some case studies where you can read some stories of councillors who got in. I personally have found, in my experience, when you ask councillors why they got into planning or why they got into local politics, they say because they wanted to advocate or work for local communities, kind of shape the area that they're in. And when you ask planners why they got into planning, it's pretty much the same answer as well. So I think there's a lot of synergy between why people get interested in local politics and why people get into planning. They want to see that change and work for their communities. So local elections are slightly different to general elections. They don't get called when somebody decides there's time for an election. They're kind of set on quite a rigid timescale. And I wish it was simple and that everybody did it the same way, but different councils have different timescales in operation. So the council that you work in might have something called by fours, which means every 4 years there's local elections and essentially everybody fights for their seat every 4 years. You might have elections by half, which means half of the councillors campaign for their seats every 2 years, or elections by thirds, which is where a third of seats become available every year, but none on the 4th year. And I've tried to represent this slightly more easy to understand in a sort of graphical way. So some of the councils will literally have all the elections happening in the first year. Some it will be kind of off on, and the most complicated councils have a third of the seats up for grabs 1 to 3 years and then nothing in year 4. So it might be different where you are. Different councils do it very differently. So they always happen in May, and the local elections next year are going to be taking place in 21 county councils, 9 unitary councils, 1 metropolitan borough council, and the Isles of Scilly and City of London. I don't think the graduates from the City of London have started yet, and I don't think we've got any graduates on the Isles of Scilly. So I think it might be okay for this year. And as with central government elections, it operates on a kind of first past the post system. So why do you need to know when local elections are happening? Well, for an officer's perspective, it's mainly around the fact that there is pre-election restrictions, what's called the pre-election period. And that describes the period of time 6 weeks before the elections where specific restrictions occur to how consultations or decisions are made within the local authority, and when you might be restricted from responding to or working with your councillors. And it's a kind of term of sort of heightened sensitivity. So during that pre-election period, councillors can't really ask you to respond to emails or provide extra resources or information that they may then go on to use in campaigning. So there's a bit of a restriction around how they can engage with officers. It quite often means that meetings where key decisions were going to be made get cancelled as well, because there really can't be anything other kind of business or usual. So that engagement and that response to emails kind of needs to be sensitively handled during the pre-election periods. So I'm going to stop sharing now. So hopefully that was a bit of a whistle-stop overview of how local elections kind of run within local authorities, and sort of basics around what you need to know. But now for the interesting part, which is Adele's presentation on how you as working officers are going to interact with members at your council and that kind of working relationship.
Thank you, Shelley. As luck would have it, I've been having some technical problems this morning and I can't seem to get it so that I can see my slides and see all the people on the screen at the same time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my slides and you tell me whether you can see them or not. I'll take my own camera out as well to make life easier. But yeah, just let me know if you can see. Oops, hang on, I need to share screen first, apologies. See, this is a fundamental thing about councillors as well. They may not be technically savvy. You know, they could be of any age. You know, people can become councillors. You could become a councillor at 80 if you so wish to. So you know, you don't expect that councillors will even understand the that they've been given by your local authority. So let me just do my sharing and hopefully.
Yeah, I think the youngest councillor there is 18, and I think the oldest one is 87. So it's a real kind of breadth of age ranges.
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Exactly. I'll talk you through. So Shelley obviously has set out a little bit of background about councillors and who they are, and you know, it never ceases to amaze me actually how so many people don't really understand the political processes at all. So there's no reason why, when you become a planning officer working for the local authority, why you should necessarily understand how it all works and who they are. So this is so apologies if you are all actually members of political parties and are currently out actively delivering leaflets, because you can, I think, at the level that you're at, you're not politically restricted. Of course, you will discover that you know, when people reach senior office, they aren't allowed to be politically involved. But actually, it's not uncommon for people to be a councillor in one authority and an officer in another authority. Now, you can be an officer, you know, my former colleague, for example, was an officer in community safety in another authority. But you could be a planning officer in an authority and a local councillor in the authority where you live. And particularly, actually, something like a town councillor or a parish councillor, which is a slightly sort of lesser level of engagement. Anyway, so first click, please, Shelley. So I suppose, yeah, the first thing is, why do people stand for election? I mean, Shelley's talked a little bit about that, which is the kind of representation, you know, representing the community, getting the best outcomes for them. So in my case, for example, I was working with local community organisations, and I was a bit of an activist, and I became a councillor because I thought, well, it can, you know, take that a level further and actually influence decisions. So, you know, which is the second part of that. It's, you know, you can take it into a different level, particularly if you're, you know, frustrated with the way your local authority is behaving. If you're in administration, of course, you can represent, you are in control of the council, and so you can kind of enact some of your party political policies, either the local ones or the national ones. And if you're in opposition, you can still represent those views, but obviously, you know, you will do it in a different way and you have slightly less power. And then sometimes to further their political career. So it depends where it is. London seems to be quite a good stepping stone for some councillors into being an MP. They sort of do 4 years here, and then they get on the kind of the national list to stand as an MP somewhere. I mean, that's not so common, you know, and even amongst those people, there are very few of them that haven't got involved because they actually want to make a difference. Next slide, please, Shelley. So who are they accountable to? Well, they are accountable to their immediate electorate, you know, the people who have in their ward or parish area who have voted for them. Next one. They're also accountable to the council, so there are certain standards of behaviour, and you are a member of the council, and so you do have to think a little bit collectively. And that means not just representing your residents in your immediate ward or immediate area, but the wider community as well. And then, of course, often you'll be part of a political party, so you are accountable to your political party and your behaviours. In some of the political parties, we actually have a whipping system, so that if anybody misbehaves in any way, they can be sort of talked to, but not everybody. I think the Green Party, for example, they don't have a whipping system, so they're not. I mean, they are accountable, and you are expected to adhere by your kind of political party's general processes and policies. There's a separate accountability. So back to the accountability of the council, which is the accountability for standards in public life. So if you do really terrible things, you don't have the standards committee in quite the same way anymore, but you know, you can't just go out and behave as you feel without any consequences, usually. Well, okay, let's not. Okay, next. So working with councillors, so particularly working as planners, you know, it's really important to, when you start with whichever authority you start with, find out what the protocols are for working with members. So depending on the size of your authority, the size of your team, the number of councillors you've got, because the number of councillors in an authority, we've got 63 councillors in Southwark. I'm working with a local authority, a district council that's got 36. You know, it varies dramatically. So the size of your team will vary and the number of councillors will vary. And also whether or not you've got parish councils. Again, in Southwark we have no parish councils and no town councils, so you've got that sort of extra layer. But find out sort of quite early on from your manager, your team leader, find out really early on what it is that you've got as a protocol. And if you haven't got a protocol, if you're bold enough to suggest that they might think about a protocol, because it's very easy for planners to get really tied up by a couple of individuals who will drive you mad, because they're asking constant questions and they don't like your answers, and so they will keep coming back. And you sometimes get residents groups who will write reams and reams and reams in an email objection, and then they'll get other people to do the same. So you know, see if you can find out, you know, because otherwise, you know, you will get completely caught up in that, and you'll find it hard to actually find the time to process the application that you've got to process. And I think be honest with members as well, in, you know, obviously in a polite way, but you know, they are entitled to ask questions, and you kind of want them to ask questions. Even planning committee members, you want them to be asking questions in advance whilst the application is going through that sort of initial process. But you know, be realistic with them about how much time you've got for meetings or conversations, and try and restrict that. And always, obviously, if you're having problems, you talk to your team leader, or if you need advice about how to structure it, your team leader should be able to help you with that. Next one. So councillors. So any councillor could be contacting you to ask questions. Shelley went through the sort of the range of different councillors or different roles that councillors might have. And they might be asking for different reasons. So, you know, a planning committee councillor could be asking you for some technical clarification points. They shouldn't really be asking you questions in a way that shows any kind of bias, but we do separate training about that with planning committee members. But it could be the leader of the council who is coming to ask you, because it's, you know, they might be asking you how this application sits with the wider policies in the council and the wider development of the council. So, you know, try and establish straight away, as councillors, you know, or people who had to deal with the press, we were always taught to kind of think straight away, what's your angle? And in a way, it kind of applies to this, you know, try and work out where they're coming from, asking you the questions, and be cautious, because in some cases, you know, they're asking you things to almost to catch you out. So just be very, very clear and very careful about your answers. And residents, you know, will be going to the councillors, you know, quite often to get something stopped, because yeah, unfortunately you will find, and that's quite often with independents or sort of independent residents groups or residents groups, you will often find that they've got elected on the basis that they're going to stop all the development because, you know, it's all on the green belt, or it's in, you know, the countryside, and, you know, elect me, vote for me, and we'll stop everything. And of course, we have got some independent authorities who are struggling now, having found that it's not that straightforward to just stop everything from happening, and indeed shouldn't be stopping everything from happening. But the other thing to remember is that councillors aren't governed by the same sort of working policies and protocols. So, you know, there is a certain expected behaviour when you're an employee, particularly when you're an employee of the local council, you know, about how to behave. So they can be quite abrupt, they can be quite rude. Although, as I say, you know, they are answerable in a way to their political grouping. They might not have a political grouping. They could literally be an independent individual councillor who has nobody kind of looking at them. So I'm not condoning it, but you might find it that you come across that because, yeah, they don't have the same disciplinary for example, that you might have if you were an officer and you marched into your team leader's office and said, "Oh," you know, you wouldn't behave like that in a local authority. There are sort of rules. Same rules don't quite apply for councillors, so just be aware of that. But that doesn't mean that you have to put up with, and with that. And if you are having problems, again, go and see your team leader. Go and talk to someone about it and get some kind of senior help with an issue. And it might well be, depending, so going back to the start, it might, depending on what your process is within your authority for working with councillors, it may well be that you've got some kind of system in place for certain councillors even. Next, Shirley.
Yeah, I would just before we move on, add to that. So most councils that you work with will have kind of set time periods for responding to emails or phone calls from members of the public. And again, that doesn't often apply to councillors. So, you might have a kind of, we aim to respond within 21 days, 10 days to kind of emails and inquiries, but councillors can literally come along and say, I want this answer by the end of the day or by lunchtime, and they aren't kind of governed by those usual kind of set time frames for responding to inquiries.
No, absolutely. Next slide. So, yeah, every now and again, excuse me, councillors are right. They pick up something that every now and again, there are some quirks of a local area that a ward councillor who knows their area very well might pick up on. So if they do, they come to you and they say, "Oh, you haven't factored in such and such." Be patient. Don't dismiss them outright. Cross-check the evidence, against the evidence that you've had from the applicants and the objectors, and feed back to the councillors, and explain to them that you have looked at it and that these are the reasons why you think whatever it is that they've raised isn't, quite often, of course, it's not a material planning consideration anyway, but even if it is a material planning consideration, it may not be relevant, or it may not affect the recommendation that you're going to make. And sometimes people, the hardest ones, ironically, are the householder extensions at the back, where people get terribly agitated about overlooking and things like that, unnecessarily, or they bring in party wall agreements, which are nothing to do with planning, as you know. But yeah, try and be patient with them, and just be very clear with them in your responses, not dismissive, but helpful and clear, and say, thank you for bringing that to my attention. I've had a look, and yes, we don't think because of X, Y, and again, direct them to policy. In other words, send them to have a look for themselves if you've got local plans in place, which I know not everybody has. Okay, next. So yes, so just when you think you've got it all sorted, your little householder extension, that you're all ready to sign it off, you find that your authority has a system where any member can call absolutely anything in. And at PAS, we are trying to get people out of the habit of doing that. As part of our training programs, is we do try and discourage it, but there are some who, and it's particularly the planning committees that sit all day, because they seem to think, well, it doesn't matter because we've got all day. So if we have like 10 applications on, and it takes an hour each, it's okay because we've got all day. So yeah, so you might find that. So what happens with the committee? Next, please. So then you find that all of your councillors, so this particularly relates to, how the councillors sitting on the committee are going to look at the recommendation that you've made and the report that you have done. So the biggest challenge, obviously, is, why have the officers why the officers recommend this for approval? It's not in the local plan, or it's not policy compliant. And obviously, the bigger the scheme, the more you've had to balance the different policies and give different things weight. So yeah, understanding the weight that can be given to the decision making. Not all councillors on the planning committee are there because they fully understand planning. Sometimes people have to sit on the committee because you've got to because your planning committee is a certain size. Again, it's something that we talk to authorities about. Do you really need to have all of your members on the planning committee? As members of the planning committee, can you reduce it down to a more manageable number so that you don't have people on those committees who are there because, you know, we've got 3 places left, who's going to fill them? Because, you know, you're not really going to get people then who are engaged in doing it properly, as it were. And also, you know, so going back to the bit about why councillors, why people choose to become councillors, to represent their electorate, and again, particularly if they've been elected on the basis of trying to get things stopped, they will have a lot of local residents saying to them, well, you know, we don't want this, we don't like this, we don't think it's right. We think that, you know, the traffic is the classic one that will come up over and over again. You know, the traffic's already bad, this is just going to make it worse. But your highways team, of course, have been through it and said, no, it's not going to make it worse. We know this because we looked at it. But for councillors, it's really, really difficult. And the last point is what makes it particularly difficult, because as councillors, councillors often worry that if they approve things against the wishes of their residents, they won't be re-elected. And it has happened, actually. And there was a council leader who lost his seat on the basis of some planning decisions that he made. And, you know, that is always in the back of your mind. When I train councillors, I always say to them that, you know, it's really important that you have open and honest conversations with your communities about what you can and can't achieve, and try and explain a little bit about the planning process. But it is complicated, and it's very complicated for people to understand, and it's particularly complicated for residents to understand who have never ever been engaged in anything related to planning until somebody is going to build a big development in the field behind where they live, and all of a sudden they're like, whoa, hang on, what's going on? And so the residents have suddenly got to learn about how planning works, which is pretty tough. I mean, you know, you've been through university to learn how planning works. So yeah, it's great. It does get quite hard then for councillors, I think, to explain to them, you know, why it has to happen like that. And there is always that nagging about re-elected. I say, if you have honest conversations, you will get re-elected, as I did, but not everybody's confident about that. So what goes wrong is the next one. So, you know, you get your, yeah. So what goes wrong is that councillors feel so much under pressure that they just buckle and they refuse, and they don't really have any reasons. And even though your head of planning and your legal officer, if you have one, are saying, well, councillor, you know, I'm not quite sure, could you be a bit clearer, you know, and direct me to the policy behind your reason for refusal? But you know, that doesn't always work, and sometimes councillors, you know, they don't have valid reasons, but they vote to refuse something just because they feel like they're under so much pressure. Sometimes councillors don't agree with officers' interpretation of policy, and again, if it's a big scheme and you're giving different things weighting, you know, it's possible. It's possible to have a different interpretation of policy or to look at different policies. Sorry, I've got these slides the wrong way round, because yes, back to sometimes they do refuse it, but they don't actually have any grounds. They just make something up, or it's usually traffic, green belt, countryside. Yeah, they'll come up with some reason for refusal that may or may not.
What one of the other common ones is it's ugly, or we don't like the design, because you can kind of say, well, you know, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and what officers and kind of professionals might say is this is a good quality design. You know, members can quite legitimately say, I don't like it. It's too modern. It's you know, it needs to be a mock Tudor house, not a, you know, brand new modern method of construction. So that's the one we tend to see. It's not only, you know, it's those decisions that can be quite nuanced and have a difference of opinion.
Yes, design is subjective, as they say.
Yeah.
Okay, so next slide. So yeah, so again, you know, actually, why do all of those factors affect the decisions that people make? And that's actually because sometimes the councillors on the planning committees don't understand fully the processes and the policies. Sometimes they haven't actually read the papers. Shocking though that may sound, but you know, they're often busy. You know, they've got full-time jobs, daytime jobs. They're trying to read the papers on the way in or whatever. But also planning, and as I said, you know, you have been to college, to university, and you have learnt about planning, and it takes a while to really get your head around it. And then again, it's the well, not just under pressure from the local residents to turn things down, but actually sometimes there may be, so you're not allowed to be whipped if you're a councillor on a planning committee. You're not allowed to be instructed by your political group or your group, your councillor group, which way to vote. However, you know, there are sometimes, you know, the ward councillors, for example, you're sitting on the planning committee, and the ward councillors who might be from your council group will be sitting there as objectors, giving you all sorts of reasons why you should refuse it. And you know, it can put you in a really, really difficult situation. So sometimes councillors will cave and not make quite the right decisions. And sometimes they don't understand, and sometimes they don't care about the consequences of refusing, you know, because they don't, you know, they think, oh, well, it'll just go to appeal and let the inspector sort it out. Actually, of course, we know that is not a good way for a whole host of reasons, not least because it's expensive for the council to go to appeal. But if they're opposition councillors, they don't care about things like that as much as the people who are running the council. They are not so worried about the fallout. You know, they will of course get good press in the local press if they have refused something that a lot of the community are angry about, regardless of whether or not. And Shelley and I have both done. We do a role play exercise with planning committee members where exactly that happened. Something was refused. And it's a live case that Shelley worked on, in fact, where the planning committee have refused something. It's been in the press, yeah, refused, victory for the residents, yeah. Then it's gone to appeal and they've lost the appeal. And then the press are, oh, council, all that waste of money, terrible waste of money, shocking council decision, you know. So, you know, it's, yeah. So yeah, so that's what happens. Anyway, next slide, please. Yeah, so that's the thing about specifically about committee, and probably when you start, a lot of your applications won't be significant applications. You'll probably be dealing with more minor things, although as I said, you can get, you know, a lot of extensions or you know, things in, depending where you are in the country, you know, things, farmhouses that are being turned into something else, or barns that are turned into houses, and you know, people get up in arms about. But yeah, no matter what the declarations are made about the decisions being impartial, and the decisions should be impartial, they absolutely, it is unlawful, in fact, for your political party to direct you to vote in a particular way. But it is political, as Shelley said right at the beginning. You know, councillors make the decisions, and actually that's not just really about the plan on the planning committee. You know, a lot of the interactions that you will have with planners, with other members of the council, whether they are the cabinet members, the ward councillors, or members of the planning committee, you know, in the background there is that element of, because they've all got elected on different basis. I mean, you know, this is a prime time actually in a way to be doing this, because everybody has a heightened awareness of the general election and all of the different policies that are being put forward, you know, by the different political parties. And so in the back of your mind, you know, you're looking at that partly with that political policy in the back of your mind, as well as working with the policies. And as you know, planning is not an exact science anyway. I mean, 2 council officers can come to different decisions on an application. It has been known. But you know, and again, that thing about councillors can lose, you know, can lose their seats or not get re-elected if it's felt that they voted in the wrong way. But you know, with committee, if your application has gone to committee, that is the final decision. And it is a system which exists, and we have to live with it, because yes, councillors don't also like to be just rubber stamping all of the officer recommendations, because otherwise what is the point of having a committee? So it's trying to strike the balance again, you know, with the training that we do. It's trying to strike that balance with, you know, looking at a recommendation and assessing whether or not you agree fully with that recommendation and the reasons for it, or whether you think that using hopefully existing policies, you could have looked at it in a different way. And yeah, that's what the planning committee are there to do. So they may or may not agree with your recommendations, and they may or may not make a defendable different decision. But yeah, it's quite hard for you to control that, unfortunately. The best thing that you can do is make sure that you have got as much information as you can into the report, but in as concise a way as possible, because that's the other thing, is trying to get a balance with your reports so that they are clear, but and have got enough information in them for the councillors to work with, but that they just don't go on reams and reams and reams and reams. So, you know, and that is a skill obviously that you'll develop along the way, hopefully with the support of your team leaders. Next slide. So finally, they can be hostile, or they can appear hostile, but they're not your enemy. Try and be patient and try and kind of foster some good relationships, because as Shelley said at the beginning, you should all be working to the same goals. You know, you're actually all on the same team. I know it won't feel like it at some points, but you should both be trying to get the best outcomes you can for your local area. And you might have slightly different approaches to how you're going to achieve that, but I think you have to acknowledge that you have slightly different approaches, but ultimately try and work together and I have seen authorities where there's almost hostility between particularly the planning committee and the officers, and it's best to try, if you can, and kind of have a much better working relationship and not do the us and them scenario, which councillors are more prone to. It's trying to find a way around it, and some of them are difficult. I know some councillors can be extremely difficult. As I say, whilst you're juniors, I'd push them just onto your team leaders, really, if you can. Yeah, and I think that is the finally, and thank you for listening to my ramblings. Thanks, Shelley.
Thanks, Adele. Right, I'm just going to